Yes, I have crossed many boundaries and profoundly different subjects. So I've crossed boundaries in a serious way. I have quite a lot to say about that. You see, the emphasis today, if you apply for a grant or if you have a policy for your laboratory or your university, is interdisciplinarity. That is the emphasis. That's what they talk about. In reality, nobody gives a damn about interdisciplinarity. What they mean by interdisciplinarity is this, that biochemistry and chemistry, or anatomy and pathology, that is interdisciplinarity for them. But if you try, say, go from neurophysiology to philosophy, they say, well, I mean, this has got nothing to do with neurophysiology, and neurophysiology has got nothing to do with philosophy. And this is the big, big mistake, because really, in a way, all human activity is dictated by the human brain. And the study of philosophical doctrines or music or opera or art or literature gives you important insights into the organization of the brain if you study it seriously. So, for example, if I may give you one specific example, when you look at the early analytic phase of Cubism, initiated by Braque and Picasso, you find that they were asking a question which was a very scientific question. It was not recognized as such at the time. The question was, how does an object maintain its identity when you view it from different angles, different distances, different lighting conditions? And that question, that's the question of form constancy. Now, Braque and Picasso started studying this in 1911. Neurophysiologists took it seriously in 1990 to 2000, but it is the same question. It's just that it's studied by a different method. What amazes me, what surprises me, is how difficult it is for people to cross boundaries through research councils, and also how hostile some people, not all, some people in the humanities have been. They think that we are invading their territory. Very, very territorial. But on the whole, I mean, there have been some very, very supportive people in the humanities and in the arts. I do not speak of artists. Artists are very, very supportive. I'm speaking of more art historians and philosophers of aesthetics. But the scientists have always been very, very interested and supportive. Now, why is that? I think the reason is that science really is driven very, very much by curiosity. And it does not matter where you seek your answers as long as you can get answers. So if you want to know about love, let us say, scientifically, you can study it in terms of neurotransmitters and neuropeptides and so on and so on. But you can also study Anna Karenina. You can study Madame Bovary. And you'll get good ideas about the nature of love. And of course, someone will tell me whenever I cite Anna Karenina or Madame Bovary, they say to me, yes, but these are love stories written by men. I say, all right, fine, and I'm going to give you Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights. She says the same thing, exactly the same thing. So it has been, in a way, an uphill struggle and a disappointment, but I must not dwell on these downsides. I must dwell on the upsides. I've had very, very good relations with many philosophers of aesthetics, with artists. Balthus is among my friends. Michelangelo Pistoletto is another one, whom are very hospitable to new ideas. The Piero Duratio. So there have been very hospitable people. Well, neuroaesthetics is essentially, and this is what people fail to understand because of the inclusion of the word aesthetics, but neuroaesthetics is essentially a study devoted to understanding how the brain works. So we try to understand what are the brain mechanisms that are involved, that are engaged during aesthetic experiences, but also allied experiences, experiences of love and desire. Um, so now, who has been writing about love and desire and beauty for 2,500 years? Not the neurobiologists, it is the philosophers of aesthetics and the art historians and so on. And so we rely on their work, on their thinking, to extract questions which are amenable for experimentation. Let me give you an example. Clive Bell, who was an English art critic, who was the husband of Vanessa Bell, he asked the following question in 1914. He said, "What do all things which are perceived as beautiful have in common?" Now, this is a fantastic question because it's amenable to experimentation. So, what do the Pietà di Michelangelo or Giotto frescoes or Chartres Cathedral, etc., what do they have in common? Now, they have never been able to answer this question, but we have answered this for them, but answered it in a specific neurobiological context. So, Clive Bell said, if you can answer that question, you have basically solved the problem of aesthetics. And we'll tell you, we've answered that question and solved the problem of aesthetics in a neurobiological context. Now, what do they answer? The answer is, whatever the source of beauty, visual, musical, mathematical, moral, sorrowful, joyful, it always leads to activity in a specific part of the brain, field A1 of the medial orbital frontal cortex, which is situated about here, all right? So now you see you have got a definition which is all-inclusive. Whenever you experience beauty, whatever its source, you have activity there. Now, this happens to be also the center for reward and pleasure, but then beauty is rewarding and it is pleasurable. Right. Well, what happens? Let's take the example of vision. First of all, you look at a beautiful painting. Let us say you look at beautiful faces. So you get areas in the brain which are specialized for face perception, which become very active when you look at faces. But when you look at beautiful faces, something else happens. You get a particular pattern of activity in these face perceptive areas. And when you get when you get these patterns in those face perceptive areas, you also get activity in the medial orbital frontal cortex. So if you want me to define for you beauty in neurobiological terms strictly, I will say it is when say facial beauty, face areas become active with patterns in them, and that also engages the medial orbital frontal cortex. And when the two are active together, then you experience beauty. Now, if you listen to music, we've not done this with music, but if you listen to music, it's a different set of areas become active, sensory areas, auditory areas. But I imagine in the same way that patterns emerge, and only when patterns emerge where the medial orbital frontal cortex also become active. So the big quest now in neurobiology of aesthetics is, what do these patterns tell you? We know the conditions, but we don't know what these patterns tell us. May I explain more about that, if I may? So we know that beauty of a face must absolutely involve certain qualities. There must be two eyes, a nose, a mouth, a forehead, all in proper relationship, all in proper proportions, and all with the symmetries, etc. But a face that has all of these is not necessarily beautiful. So there is another ineffable characteristic which renders a face beautiful. Now, we suppose that that ineffable characteristic, which we cannot define, is what is mirrored in the brain in terms of these patterns that emerge. So the question is how to get to the real meaning of these patterns. We assume the quickest way of stopping a nice dinner conversation about beauty is to say it's all subjective anyway, right? But this is not true, because a beautiful face, I'm talking of a very beautiful face, in Japan would be considered to be very beautiful in Europe. And a very beautiful face in Europe would also be considered to be a very beautiful face in America, and so on. Now, the converse is also true. It is not possible for a face with one eye here and one eye here to be considered beautiful. So there is something quite objective about that. And of course, the English painter Francis Bacon, when he said, "I want to give a visual shock." These are his words. What did he do? He mutilated faces on canvas, faces and bodies, never objects. So biological beauty, I mean, beauty of faces and bodies and landscapes and waterfalls, has got a generally objective side to it. And we have done these experiments. So if you ask people from different nationalities, different backgrounds, different races to rate beautiful faces, the variability is very low. If you ask them now instead to rate beautiful buildings, which is much more dependent upon upbringing, the variability is great. All right? Okay. So much more variability. So the idea that beauty is subjective, put like that, is not true. If you say facial biological beauty is subjective, it is not true. If you say artifactual beauty is subjective, yes, it is true. This is extremely important because it's got important social consequences. You see, I go back to what Sigmund Freud said. The purpose of life is to satisfy the pleasure principle. Now, the pleasure principle, as he used it in German, is called Lustprinzip, which means desire and pleasure. Before him, actually, the founder of this college, Jeremy Bentham, came up with this principle. Now, so the importance of that is that this center, the reward, pleasure, and experience of beauty areas, are not there just as trimmings waiting. They need to be excited and satisfied all the time. And the importance of this is social in that, you know, when you build a building, if you pay attention to the aesthetic details, this rewards people. Whenever they come home, they are rewarded. If you build buildings like they do in London, like they do in Missouri, you know, they built buildings in Missouri that were so ugly that people were defacing them all the time, and then they had to pull them down. All these buildings had to be pulled down. So you know, beauty is not a luxury. It is not a luxury. It's not a luxury to be indulged in by the few who've got money and leisure. It is for all of us because it has to be nourished. It's just like saying, you know, that the stomach is a luxury to be fed. No, the stomach has got to work all the time, and the same is true of the medial orbital frontal cortex. And I think it's very, very important to emphasize that not only for beautifying our homes and ourselves, we should also beautify our environment, because we like to come back to it if we beautify it. It is lovely to go to a beautiful home. It's depressing to go to an ugly home. I think, if I'm correct, the figure for the amount of money spent by men and women, but more women, to have plastic surgery is $56 billion every 2 years. So you see, it means something to them. It means something to them to appear also satisfying themselves when they look themselves in the mirror. And I think if you add to that the amount of money we spend on aftershaves, and by the way, men look at themselves in the mirror just as much as women do. It's a mistake to think that only women look at themselves in the mirror. And the amount of money we spend on our clothes and the paintings and things we buy, vast sums of money are spent on beauty because it is rewarding. Well, I mean, you can recognize patterns in as abstracted. But you've now jumped too far the other end. Let's go in between. Let's go in between. Let's go, for example, to the taking of Christ by Caravaggio. Right? Now that is a figurative painting. It is immensely moving. It's the National Gallery of Dublin. It's immensely moving and powerful, and no one I know who's seen it has not been totally moved by it. Now, there is a big question, a very big question, which has not been resolved, which we're working on. What is the relationship between aesthetics and emotions? I mean, you see, a painting by Mondrian can be very beautiful, but may not arouse emotions in the same way that the Pietà of Michelangelo does. Right? The two are separate. So the emotional system is probably separate from the aesthetic system, I think, but the experiments have not been done. So now to go back more specifically to your question about African art, of course, Picasso was inspired by African art, and what he saw in African art gave him a clue, and in Cézanne gave him a clue for his cubism. He could break things up to maintain the identity, and then he realized, after several years of analytic cubism, that it was not working. That when he pushed it and pushed it and pushed it, the face was no longer really recognizable as face to ordinary people. And this is what the other thing I want to emphasize is neuroaesthetics does not interest itself so much in the artist. It interests itself in the ordinary person. Let us start by asking, what has neuroaesthetics achieved in the context of beauty? Because there are other aspects of neuroaesthetics, but in the context of beauty. So let's go back 30 years when neuroaesthetics did not even exist. Who would have guessed that everything that you perceive, that you experience as beautiful, regardless of its source, would lead to activity in the same part of the brain, and that activity is proportional to the intensity of the experience. In other words, the more intensely you experience beauty, the more intense the activity there. Who would have guessed that moral beauty, definitely the Greeks had a single word, kalon, for moral and physical beauty, also leads to activity there. Who would have guessed that joyful and sorrowful beauty would lead to activity there? And who would have guessed that mathematical beauty leads to measurable proportional activity, which is proportional to the intensity of the experience? This is a tremendous advance. It tells you that that beauty is, in a way, an abstract thing which is represented in the brain. Now, there is a professor of history of science who wrote to me about mathematical beauty. He said to me, well, isn't that to be expected? Of course it's not to be expected. How would you expect? It could be anywhere in the brain. It could be in the areas of the brain where mathematical calculations are done. But no, it was in the medial frontal cortex. It shared the same area. Now, the next big question. So this is there's a full stop there after this investigation. It's always important when you start a scientific investigation to ask, where is my full stop going to be? You see, I mean, for example, for the theory of evolution, there is a full stop. With DNA, there's a full stop. This does not mean to say that lots of more work being done on it, but there is the basic story now. And the basic story with the experience of beauty in terms of brain activity is known. But there is a question of the patterns I told you about. What do they actually represent? And there is, of course, the relationship of beauty to emotions, and there's a relationship of beauty to desire, because you can see things which you may not desire, but you find beautiful. You can, a lot of things you see, you do desire. Now there's a whole area which has not been studied because it's difficult to study. For example, literary beauty. It has not been studied, or poetical beauty has not been studied. And I would say that musical beauty has not been studied in as much detail as it should. The reason why people have concentrated so much on visual beauty is because about a third of our brains are visual in function. So that's taken more time. And of course, there are other sides to beauty which have hardly been touched upon, or which we are doing, is the converse of beauty, namely ugliness. Now, beauty and not beautiful is not the same thing as not beautiful is not the same thing as ugly. These are different categories. All right. So you'd have to start, which we have started, a different set of studies on what is ugly and what is beautiful. Right. Well, this is the most interesting topic. First of all, love is of course a very central topic in neuroaesthetics. I mean, not only love of a person, but love of objects. Now, in its studies, neuroaesthetics has looked at what happens in the brain when you look at the picture of someone you love. All right. And it so turns out that whether the person you love is of the same sex or the opposite sex, and we're talking about love now, not about sexuality, the same parts of the brain are active. Okay. Now, the other thing which has come out, this is now from different labs, not our lab, is that the connectivity pattern in the brain, so if you take the extreme alpha male, macho, and you take the extreme alpha female, terribly feminine, and you look at the connectivity patterns in their brains, you establish that, you find that most of us fall in between. So we've got an androgynous brain to varying extents. There's not a single defined point of androgyny, but to various extents, which is one reason why many advertisements are androgynous. They appeal to both sexes. It's also, you could have, concluded that from reading the great literature of love, Le Notte di Figaro. It's all cross-dressing. Twelfth Night is all cross-dressing. The Bacchae of Euripides is all cross-dressing. Orlando by Virginia Woolf is all cross-dressing. And so you can get that from literature. Now, there are certain things which allude to two characteristics which you cannot get from biology, but you can get from the literature of love. But remembering that literature of love is a product of the human brain. It's a product of biology. So what are these two factors? The first factor is the concept of unity in love. That's to say, you want to belong, to become one person with your lover, right? Now, this is what you find in Tristan und Isolde. Tristan says, I'm no longer Tristan, I want to be Isolde. In Wuthering Heights, Catherine says, I am not Catherine, I'm Heathcliff. And Heathcliff says, I cannot live without my life, I cannot live without my soul, when Catherine dies. If you look at the same-sex lovers, Rumi, I am he whom I love, and he whom I love is me. If you see me, you see him. If you see him, you see both of us. And so it goes on. This concept of the unity in love is endemic throughout the literature of love. But there's another aspect. The concept of unity of love in love transmutes beyond the love of a person to the love of God. I mean, if you take Santa Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross, and St. John of the Cross says, Jesus, my bridegroom, marry me, I want to be you. It is the same. And of course, in Islamic Sufi literature, it is very, very, very prominent because only God can create a beautiful person. This is what they say. Only God can create a beautiful person. Therefore, by loving a beautiful person, by loving the creation of God, you become closer to God and you become absorbed into God. So this is one aspect of the neurobiology of love, which today is only accessible by reading the word literature of love. But you see, you have to read the world of love seriously. It's not just for enjoyment, but it's also for saying, what are they saying? Now, the other thing is, this is now transmuting from work on rodents, rats. There are two types of rats. One is a type which is very, very monogamous. They meet a mate and they remain very faithful, even if you separate them for a long time. They remain very close. The others are very polygamous, so they are very adulterous. Now, it turns out that there is a different balance of receptors in these two. And so it is a biologically ingrained thing. Now, the sort of neuropeptides, neuroreceptors that are involved are the same in humans as in these rodents. Of course, they're much more developed in us. But just think to yourself of a book, The Philanderer by Stanley Kaufman. Now, The Philanderer by Stanley Kaufman is a book which was taken to court here because they thought it was obscene many years ago. It's a story of a nice advertising agent in America who is obsessed by his desire for women. Was obsessed by his desire. And in the end, he says, I must reform myself. I must not do this because it's the ruin of my family, of my life, of everything I wanted. But he cannot do it. He cannot do it. And that is one example of biology trumping all social conventions. And this leads to important questions about the legal system. I mean, where do you lay the blame? See, so we have to revise our views of these things, and that's why neuroaesthetics has got a very large territory of action because its consequences are important. But I want to say one other thing about love, if I may.
Of course.
Very important because you see, when somebody is in love with someone, not only are there certain areas of the brain which become very active, but more importantly, or as importantly, there are certain areas of the brain which become deactivated. And these areas of the brain include the judgmental areas. So a lover is much less judgmental about the person he or she loves, which does not mean to say that they have lost their judgment. I mean, a mathematician can still have very good judgment in mathematics, but about the girl he loves or the boy he loves, no. And the consequence of this is this, that the worst time to commit to a long-lasting relationship, marriage, is when you're passionately in love. And you know who recognizes this? You will be surprised. It's the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church does not accept divorce, but in the Codex Juridica, whatever it's called, in the Catholic jurisprudence, it says, I can get you the chapter and verse of it. It says that a marriage can be annulled, not divorce, and marriage can be annulled if it can be shown that one or other of the parties contracting to the marriage lacked the discretion of judgment. All right? So, I mean, the Catholic Church is a very wise institution. It's been there for 2,500 years. Now, when we explained this to some priests, they said, you must be mad. In fact, it was a jurist at the Vatican, a lady, who pointed this out to me.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and so the consequence is that if one has a brother or a sister or a son or a daughter, and they fall in love with someone, you say, are you crazy? You fall in love with such a person in their wrong socioeconomic class, wrong education, etc. It's wasted.
Love is blind. That's what we say. Love is blind.
Love is blind. There you are. Yes. And now there's a biological reason for it. I would say that my relationship with Balthus, which was a very good, close intellectual relationship, is one in which he learned a lot more from me than I learned from him. I think he never, and I think if you look at the book, you find at the end of the book he admits to that. He never considered that all this painting is a product of the brain, right? He was that came as a surprise to him, that it is sort of really all dictated by the logic of the brain. Therefore, by looking at his paintings, I can perhaps say something about painting, about the creative process, and about him. That was an idea which he was very resistant to. Some others are not. I mean, Sagi Man, who was an English painter, realized this more because he was becoming blind, and he carried on painting. And he said to himself, well, I don't care what I paint because I'm not going to see it anyway. So he was using his knowledge from the brain. So he was not so surprised. But I think I learned a great deal from the way that Baltus approaches paintings. But on the fundamentals of painting, I think he learned more from me. And I think that's very evident in the book.